Well, hi, and a warm welcome to you all. My name is Mark Morley, and I'm the training manager for the Good Governance Academy. Today, I'm delighted to be hosting another showcase webinar featuring one of our endorsed training courses. As always, it's great to have so many registrations to this event. It's clear demonstration of how important these topics are and how critical education is to the success of our leadership. We love to know where our guests are joining from, so please do let us know where in the world you are in the chat window below. While people continue to join, I'll share some tips for those not familiar with Zoom. If you can't see the control panel on your screen, please press the Alt key on your keyboard. That will give you access to the chat box, the question box, and the reaction buttons. It's great to see your reactions, so please do make a good use of these during the event. If you have any questions you'd like me to pose, please pop these in the question box, and I'll be happy to ask these later on during the Q&A session. For those who are not familiar with the Good Governance Academy, we're a non-profit organisation that was established by Professor Mervyn King back in 2019. We collaborate with universities, business schools, professional bodies and other organisations all around the world to share information on business critical issues. We run regular webinars on current hot topics as a service to our growing community. If you'd like to see what we have planned, please head over to our events page, which I'll post a link to in the chat window below. You can also join our mailing list to be kept informed of forthcoming events. In addition to the webinars, we host colloquia twice a year. These are high-profile events which have been attended by over 10,000 people. The output of these is shared with over 5 million professionals throughout our support member network. We also run these showcase events to promote courses which the Academy has endorsed. The endorsement program is available to any organisation and involves an assessment against specific criteria. The courses we endorse are those we feel address business critical issues and provide users with current and relevant content. The endorsement is available for courses of all formats, online, in-person and hybrid. So if you have a course you'd like to put forward, please visit our training page or drop me an email. I'll include my details below. Anyone who registers for an endorsed course through the GGA will receive our certificate of attendance. And these certificates are CPD accredited by the GGA's support members. On the topic of certification, today's course is internationally accredited, and those who successfully navigate the exam are awarded a formal certification by APMG. We'll share more details on that later. But right now, I'd like to introduce Carolyn Chalmers, the CEO of the Good Governance Academy. And Carolyn will be taking us through today's showcase featuring the ISO 37000 Foundation Certificate, which she developed in partnership with Fluid Rock Governance Group. Carolyn was actually on the international ISO development team. She packed her insights and expertise into this e-learning program. So Carolyn, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today. And if I may hand over to you.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here today and also on the other side of the desk, so to speak. So thank you very much for your kind introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. It's lovely to see where everybody is from. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. I'm just sharing my screen here. You able to see that, Mark?
Yes.
Great. So today I wanted to really stop on the topic of how to govern a sustainable organization. And really, I think it's part of this need to continually develop and specifically continue training in these different topics that are emerging and the different changes that are happening in our external environment. So the need for continual learning is pressing in today's world. And these are topics that we haven't ordinarily learned about in our schooling, in our university qualifications, in our higher education. So it's really quite important for us to keep learning about these different topics. And I just want to show today how ISO 37000 is really geared as a standard for dealing with changing topics over time as we find our context is changing. So first of all, maybe let's just stop on what is a sustainable organization and where does this come from and what is the need? And then once we understand that, how 37000 helps us to govern in that context. So if people have any questions, please pop them in the Q&A. As Mark said, Mark will help us navigate the questions afterwards. And I see that Gavin is online. And Gavin, I haven't forgotten your questions that you emailed through to us, and I will respond to you as soon as I can. Then in terms of the concept of sustainable development, really it was at the end of the 20th century, in 1983, that there was global United Nations recognition that we are using our natural resources faster than they can be regenerated. We are using our atmosphere and polluting our atmosphere to points where we can't actually, as a human species, continue survival in the longer term. So the United Nations got together and said, what are we looking at in terms of our ability to cope with the growing population? Mark, since I was born, we've more than doubled. I think there's about 3 billion people on the planet when I was born. We're over 8 billion now. So how do we go about developing and continuing to develop, but in a way in which we don't, we can regenerate the environment? And that's this commission was established, and they came up with concepts of the 3 pillars of sustainable development. It's called the Brundtland Report because Brundtland chaired the commission, and anyone can pop over to their publication, Our Common Future. And it's really that definition of sustainable development that underpins all of the concepts of sustainability in today's world. So the report highlighted 3 main pillars. Of course, it's economic growth. So when we talk about sustainability, we mustn't forget about the financial and economic sustainability of organizations today, but it's within the context of the environment and society as well. So just using the acronym People, Planet, Prosperity as being a go-to phrase for what sustainable development means is really considering society, the environment, and the economy as the core context within which we operate today, and we must operate and consider for sustainability, for long-term sustainability. That has been recognized not only nationally with the nations coming together in United Nations, but even by investors of the great stock markets of the world. So Ocean Tomo is a research house, and they've researched the S&P 500 market to better understand what criteria investors use when making their investments in stock markets today. And you can see how that has significantly shifted from the 20th century thinking, where really the tangible assets were used, the balance sheets, the additives on the balance sheet, or the balance sheet was used as the annual financial statements were used as our mechanisms for investment, through to the 21st century after the Brundtland Commission, where it's really gone into the intangible assets. Now, at the beginning of this 21st century, those intangible assets were things like, you can think about brand and brand reputation, Coca-Cola, DHL, those kinds of big brands. But it's even more in today's world. And so organizations and even the United Nations were trying to unpack what these tangible assets were and how these intangible assets could be quantified. And that's where we came up, the world moved to this concept of ESG. So it's not saying we're not looking at the financial. The financial still makes up 10% of our considerations of our investment opportunity, but we also need to look at 90% as intangible assets, and those intangible assets are along the lines of the governance of the organization, the making sure, the sustainability in terms of succession planning, the independent oversight, internal controls, all of those kinds of things with governance, and then looking at how the organization operates in the context of this triple context, the environment and society. So that's where the concept of ESG came from, is not excluding financial, but it's talking to the intangible assets. And you can see today, and this is 4 years ago, that 90% of decisions of the investors on the S&P 500, and this is based on evidence, is really is considering intangible assets, these ESG factors. So it doesn't matter whether we've got politicized considerations of sustainability or environmental considerations in the US, or we've got Europe's really progressive left field thinking in terms of sustainability, the markets themselves are saying that we need to consider sustainability in our investment decisions. And it makes sense for then the Financial Stability Forum, or board as it's called now, to get involved in the three pillars, because there's not only the economic financial stability, but the financial stability around that economic pillar, but also environmental and social impacts. So it was round about the financial, the impacts of Enron, Chernobyl, Gopal in India, all of these large environmental disasters, that the G7 Financial Stability Forum was actually established. And in 2001, as a result of the globalization, they were the large party behind the establishment of the IFRS Foundation. Now, we know today the IFRS Foundation is the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, and that really brings this two main standards around the world, is the US-based GAAP, generally accepted accounting practices, which comes from FASB, and then we have the IFRS standards, which the rest of the world really adopts as their financial reporting standards. So it was the Financial Stability Forum out of the G7, those large nations, that established largely the consolidation of financial standards. Of course, after the global financial crisis, we understood that it's not just the G7 and it doesn't just take consolidated financial standards. There was far more impact of social and need for financial stability. So we got a broadening to the G20 in 2009, and establishment of the Financial Stability Board as we know today. And really, it's the strengthening prudential oversight of this financial environment. Now, why is this important? Because really what we're talking about is not only the organization and stuff. I can just use governance as being the organization's impact and recognition of this impact on environment and society. So if we can consider this as inside out, so the impact of the organization on environment and society, which is really where the Brundtland Commission was working, but also the impact of the environment and society on organizations, which is essentially outside in. So we've got almost this consideration of double materiality. So material matters and impacts on an organization, both from the inside out and the outside in terms of impacts on on and by the organization. Initially, in the early 2000s, we had the development of the GRI guidelines. In 2003, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, first stock exchange in the world to adopt the GRI guidelines in terms of requiring listed entities to report on sustainability matters. And then in 2011, we had the establishment of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which really started developing standards of the impacts of environment and society on the organization. So we got these two standards. In fact, SASB came out of the GRI. We got these two standards bodies being developed, and after 2011, as you saw, the pressure from the markets and recognizing this need for ESG reporting, the environmental, social, and governance aspects, these intangible aspects, we got more and more and more standards. Even asset managers themselves were coming up with their own standards. So we had all this proliferation of standards, and really that is not sustainable. Like the the Financial Stability Board went about creating the financial standards, we needed to have the consolidation essentially of sustainability reporting standards as well, so that investors can make decisions in terms of their investments. So the Financial Stability Board started again getting involved and helping organizations. And the first topic on sustainability in terms of reporting that they addressed was on climate, on the climate aspects. Now, climate certainly isn't the most pressing problem in terms of humanity's continued existence. We know that we've breached far more radically in terms of our ability to survive as a species in cases of biodiversity and nitrogen and biogases in our atmosphere. But certainly climate is one that's very tangible and easier for organizations to grapple with, because it's a bit like currency, financial currency. When it comes to climate, the Kyoto Protocol has identified these 6 different greenhouse gases. And we're able, through various mechanisms, to bring these 6 different currencies of climate-related impacts down to an equivalent of CO2. So we have a CO2 as a currency. So like an organization operates in South Africa, we're in South African rands, even though we might trade in dollars and euros and pounds, we as an organization report using rands. And likewise, with climate, we had an ability to report using carbon equivalent or CO2 equivalents. So which is your, the way in which you can report. But using this ESG concept and bearing in mind that this is additionally to financial reporting, what the Financial Stability Board looked at is the climate-related financial disclosures to say to organizations, what do your investors need to know when it comes to sustainability around that it deals with the topic of climate. And they came up with these 4 pillars that are pretty much seen today, 10 years later, in our sustainability standards that are being published. And there's your G from ESG, but they say that to understand what an organization is, how an organization is addressing certainly climate and climate-related impacts is on the organization, but the organization's impacts on climate is in 4 aspects. First of all, how the organization is governed in terms of this matter. And you can understand where I say ISO 37000, it starts there. It starts with the governance of the organization, and then how that translates into the organization's strategy. And the strategy then incorporates the organization's risk management, but looking for not only a treatment of risk from a mitigation perspective and threats, but also looking at the opportunities, moving in specifically on climate-related financial disclosures and a global endeavor to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There's tremendous opportunities in that the board needs to consider, the governing body needs to consider. And then finally, the reporting aspects, the metrics that you should be using, standardizing on those to report on these topics, and targets, but not targets in terms of what every organization should be setting as a target, but how to go about setting your own targets. And here I talk about, yes, there are national targets, which are kind of the Olympic targets. But what we need to do as an organization is we need to strive for our personal bests, our PBs, right? So we need to set targets that are our stretch targets for us as an organization to do our personal best. So all our new standards today around sustainability disclosures and specifically financial related disclosures really stem from the Financial Stability Board's work of these 4 aspects in terms of reporting. And we know from governance that reporting is just a demonstration of accountability. So it's how to hold organizations accountable for their ability, in this case, to govern climate and to address matters of climate, risks and opportunities. I popped the slide in to say that we mustn't forget the UN SDGs. The Sustainable Development Goals are due in 2030, so we're 6 years away, very close. They were established in 2016. Again, these are national goals, but these are something that these are goals that countries will be requesting the organizations in their countries to report against, because the countries are going to be reporting against these goals to the UN. So another requirement for reporting. So not only your regulators, whether you're a listed entity or even your company's house or your company's regulator is going to require you to start reporting on sustainability matters, but even your country is going to require you to report on these matters, because every country has bought into the UN Sustainable Development Goals that that countries are going to be reporting on in terms of its achievements of goals in 2030. Mark, I know I'm trying to teach you how to drink from a fire hydrant here. Stop me, please pop in the Q&A if there are any questions. I've gone through all of these acronyms fairly fast, and then I'll land on the governance and how we get up to speed with these. But to say that in 2023, really, it all started coming together, where we've got corporate reporting standards that really stabilized on the global reporting initiative standards, the GRI standards, on the impact materiality, the organization's impact on environment and society, and then on the IFRS side, in terms of the impact of the environment and society on the organization, specifically financial related disclosures. So from that perspective, so it's related to your financial statements. Of course, every market regulator, the JSE, Johannesburg Stock Exchange, has got its own guidance, regulators, companies, houses, etc., all adopting their own standards. United States, the SEC is still debating, it's still political. European has adopted in 2023, I'll show you that. Japan, Australia, China, and many others are adopting their own national standards. And then we can look for some international frameworks. The Financial Stability Board has moved on from climate, has now initiated the establishment of a task force on TNFD, task force on nature-related financial disclosures. They are now establishing, which will be launched in September, a task force on inclusivity and social-related financial disclosures. Of course, we've got SBTI, the Science-Based Targets Network, and Science-Based Target Setting. There is the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. So here are some international frameworks that we look to. And of course, then we've got the international policy setting, the Paris Agreement. And we heard from the UN Secretary General just last week that in 4 years' time, 2028, the whole world would have breached the 1.5 degree post-industrial era level. Many countries in the world, many areas in the world have already breached 1.5, but the whole world then will be 1.5 degrees, have breached that 1.5 degrees limit. And we know that humanity can't exist at 3 degrees above pre-industrial era. It doesn't matter how many air conditioners we have, we won't be able to exist at 3 degrees. So this is really a very important matter that all boards of all organizations need to be aware of. So here we have essentially I've just mapped against the standards. In the middle we have these are the International Accounting Standards Board standards. So this is our traditional financial statements that we produce according to those standards. We have the impact of the environment and society on the International Sustainability Standards Board standards, both of these belonging to the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, the IFRS. And then on this side, we have the GRI. Now, the European Union, as I mentioned, they are far ahead in terms of adopting standards collectively across that regional economic trading hub. And the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group are advising the European Union on standards for its climate corporate CSRD, Corporate Social Responsibility Directive, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD. And within that corporate sustainability reporting directive, we have the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, ESRS. So many acronyms, Mark. And EFRAG, the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, are advising them on that. And I'd just like to show how these standards incorporate both the GRI and the ISSB standards work. I took it out. It's in the slide deck that I posted to the website page, Mark. It's in there. So you'll see how the European Union has these different topics, not only climate, which is the only standard that we have from ISSB so far. They are working on biodiversity and social, but also on other topics like and incorporating some of the GRI topics as well in these European standards. But what today is all about, and I know I've already taken 20 minutes, is how to govern in this context. So if this is the new context that we operate in, this need for sustainability driven not only from our investors, but driven just by the factors living on this planet, how do we as directors and governing bodies go about governing in this environment? And as I mentioned, ISO 37000 is a standard that comes from ISO that gives us international guidance. It's the only standard that has been internationally adopted as a standard for the governance of organizations. Now, we hear about the OECD corporate governance standards. Certainly the G20 was involved in those. The OECD, the Organization for Economic and Cooperative Development, those standards are to establish the regulatory frameworks within every country to support the adoption of corporate governance or governance standards. So it creates global regulatory environments. That's what that standard is for. Then the International Corporate Governance Network, ICGN, has also established governance principles. And those governance principles are really driven from an investor perspective. What should investors be looking for when it comes to the governance of an organization? What ISO 37000 does is we took all of the standards for corporate governance from around the world, the standards, the codes, the regulations, including South Africa's King IV report, and we pulled them together and we said, what does the world believe good governance looks like? And we looked at from all perspectives, for all sizes, types of organizations, in all legal frameworks, unitary board, dual boards. And I see that Patrice Lasserre is online today. Patrice was one of the members of our South African Bureau of Standards Technical Committee that was involved in the development of the ISO 37000 standard. Just looking at the standard, I thought the definition of corporate governance was so important. It's a human-based system. And I wanted to call that out as we move into another topic that perhaps, Mark, in our next ISO 37000 webinar, we can talk about that topic in governing in an AI world. In fact, we have the Good Governance Academy has a global summit on ethics and technology on the 26th of June. So maybe you can pop that into the chat, or one of the members. I see we've got quite a few GGA subscribers here online. If you could just pop that link to that global summit on ethics and technology on the 26th of June. But these are the countries that were involved in the development of ISO 37000, the blues being voting members, the orange being the observing members. You see that Africa has largely not participated except the economic powerhouses. But to say that Africa is participating, and I'll show you here now. In terms of standardization, it's an ISO standard. So it's in French, but I won't say it in French. ISO is actually the International Organization for Standardization, or Standardization Organization. And it was established really after the Second World War by the United Nations, and it's still under the guidance of the United Nations Economic and Social Council. So the importance for that is that the reason for this standard is to facilitate international trade. It's to allow organizations around the world to understand what is expected when another organization said that they apply the principles of ISO 37000. What can you expect? And it can be for every organization in every country. So across Africa, we started to use the UK's very old now Cadbury report from the 1990s. We had started using the King reports from South Africa as guidance documents throughout Africa, but largely the national standards and codes and reports are really established with national compliance and laws and regulations in mind, and the constitution of the country. So the adoption of ISO 37000 really helps us in contexts where we don't have regulatory guidance, and organizations can very easily pick up ISO 37000. Even public sector can pick up ISO 37000 as a guidance for good practice on the governance aspects. So facilitating international trade, we participate as countries, but as nominated experts and elected experts to participate at an international level. So we look in our technical committees as our mirror committee, we look at diverse range. We have people in South African Bureau of Standards, we have people from industry, from academia, from regulators all over, professional associations, all sorts of different representatives, practitioners, board members themselves, so involved in actually what would work for them. We had a huge representative from the SME sector, trade unions at an ISO level, so huge participation to make sure that this really is applicable and appropriate for all sizes and types of organizations. Now in South Africa, and this is what's happening internationally now, is we've taken that ISO standard and we've adopted it for our local conditions and adapted it for our local conditions. And our Bureau of Standards went through a process of local and national facilitation to bring in comments and criticisms, etc. And we've adopted this now as we call it a SANS, South African National Standard. And our South African National Standard was adopted in 2023, even though this standard was published, ISO 37000 was published in 2021. Other countries around the world are also adopting and this ISO 37000 as their national standard as well. A quick stop on the standard, and I know we've done several webinars on ISO 37000. So how does this fit in with the sustainability context? So 37000 says you need to, first of all, before you go about governing, you need to have the conditions for good governance, and which conditions for good governance can thrive. So those mean, in terms of 37000, we need to have the right composition and structure of the board, but importantly, the governing body needs to be competent. And competent means that you understand the topics that the matters that the organization is facing and the industry that the organization is in. So the competence of a governing body in today's world must include sustainability understanding. So as a very basic level, and Mark, I use my poor family all the time, so let me use them now. So when I send my kids to school and they learn, when they went to primary school, as your kids are in that age, my kids are a little bit older now, but a little bit, Mark. They learned when they went to school, recall. That was the first way of learning. So 2 times table, and it just recall. And your first tests when you go to school are recall the information. So the first level of competence for a board member is to be able to recall the appropriate acronyms. So as a board member, you should understand in your country what ESG means, what it means for your organization, what IFRS stands for. Certainly you wouldn't have to know what the different IFRS 18, 16, IAS 3, 38, etc. mean. And we wouldn't want you to expect what IFRS S2 means in terms of climate disclosures, but certainly you need to understand enough to be able to govern the organization through its sustainability. So the levels of understanding, we have to be able to, as board members, just recall that information. And understanding from being involved in IT for so many years at a board level, Mark, it's more than just understanding the acronyms and being able to work with that terminology without being, well, for many years I called IFRS IFRS. Apparently that's like emphasizing the wrong syllable, right? It's IFRS, not IFRS. Many people still say IFRS, but anyway. So being seen to be competent is the recall. But as a board member, we also need to understand and we need to apply. So those are two different levels of learning. We need to do more than just be able to parrot it back. We need to actually understand it. So in IT terms, I say board members must know how to set up their calendar on their phone and be able to navigate the difference between their phone with their laptop. Just some basics, be able to use, have Spotify on, just the basics, just be able to understand the basics of technology to be able to govern technology. So that's understanding that world and being able to converse in that world, not just be able to recall parrot fashion the acronyms. So Mark, I just wanted to position that in terms of not incompetence, competence. Integrated governance is really very important. And this is another condition for good governance. So integrated governance really means that the governing body's say and intentions for the organization are felt throughout the organization. So it's not just it lives with the CEO and the CEO keeps quiet and it doesn't go anywhere from there, that people don't know who the board are. I mean, certainly when I was in corporate life, never met the board. But, I didn't know what their directives were for the organization. That has to change. We have to make sure that it's integrated, that there's effective delegation throughout the organization, specifically when it comes to sustainability, because it affects every aspect of the organization. Marketing, you need to know that what you're saying in the market is what your stakeholders are expecting you to say. You're not going to say things short of getting reputational damage to say, we're not going to do anything about our oil spill or our emissions, or we don't care about our plastic packaging. Certainly the youth of today are not going to accept that from stakeholders. And it means that marketing need to understand where the board is coming from, their directives for sustainability. It means that your HR department needs to understand, because they need to employ the right people who have some understanding. It means that the data people need to understand, because they need to collect data for these reports. Technology people need to understand, because they need to be able to get in data from PDFs. And how do we do that? What tools are available? AI tools are available to scrape data off your statement from Eskom or from your energy provider. So the whole organization, and that's why I use this diagram, the whole organization really is involved. And that's a condition for good governance, is making sure that understanding is integrated throughout the organization through effective communication and delegation. Then this is where ISO 37000 lives, is really in this diagram of the framework for the principles for ISO 37000. I have on the web page as well put this, that you can download the official presentation deck from when ISO 37000 was published. It gives a little bit more information. You can also go to the ISO web page on it. But just to say that sustainability lives throughout the standard, from the purpose of the organization, which talks about the ultimate value that the organization is expecting to generate, and the values in which those need to be applied when generating that value, through to the 4 foundational principles of value generation in terms of understanding stakeholder expectations and establishing objectives for value beyond financial value. So that's a key consideration of sustainability, is that there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers. What we're saying in the 21st century is that our loser cannot be the environment and society all the time. There have to be winners sometime. And we have to have economic loss sometime to be able to cater for that. So we're going to have to spend money to move away from our greenhouse gas emissions into more renewable energy sources, for example. So we're going to have to be explicit that our dividends and our financial returns are going to be less while we spend more money on the winners being the environment or society. We're going to spend less on this, less dividends, more on society and the environment, or more dividends, less on society and the environment. We've been having that for the centuries now. So value generation says we instinctively know and we set our financial targets every year. What we need to better understand before we even get into strategy is what value beyond just financial value we need to consider for sustainability. Then we can go about setting our strategy, putting our policies around strategy. We can oversee that the organization is implementing that strategy, and then we can disclose, using these sustainability standards, the organization's results as a demonstration of accountability. So these are our core enabling principles, and around that we've got these foundational principles. Around that we've got our enabling principles for the 21st century, and those include stakeholder engagement, which we have to do in today's world. 8 billion people, we've got many more stakeholders than we had when I started in corporate life. Ethical and effective leadership, data and decisions, risk governance, sustainability. And we saw that from the Financial Stability Board's TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. They spoke about governance being all of this. Strategy called it out, but also risk governance. So the ability for the organization's board to practice good risk management itself, as well as overseeing the organization's risk management. And then so the two sustainability principles on social responsibility and then viability and performance over time. Now, quite interestingly, if you are adopting ISO 37000 as the standard for your organization's governance, which you can do alongside any of your existing regulations, codes, reports, King 4, etc., they live alongside each other, no problem. You are automatically adopting the concept of double materiality. So that's the board recognizing both inside out impacts in terms of the GRI reporting, as well as outside in impacts in terms of the IFRS and SASB standards. So both materialities, the financial impact and environmental and social impacts. So those concepts are both. So the board is recognizing that the organization can have both material impacts, even if you're only reporting on financial related impacts according to IFRS standards. The board should recognize it in everything it does. And then the outcomes on the outside in terms of responsible stewardship, effective performance, and ethical culture. Just stopping on those quickly because those are really quite important for sustainability. Ethical behavior, obviously, just considering that the changing requirements of behavior, the behavior of the 1980s is certainly not what's expected of organizations in the 2020s. There's just such a significant change in the last 40 years of expected ethical behavior. We also understand when ethical behavior isn't practiced, the impacts of that. We think about Enron, Steinhoff, just so many disasters, governance disasters. Responsible stewardship and effective performance are the two I just whistle stop on. So responsible stewardship in the standard talks about and speaks about multi-capitals. So not only considering financial capital. Now, I was presenting this the other day, and the organization came back and said, surely financial capital should be at the bottom now. It's one of your considerations, but it shouldn't be at the top. Just make people aware that all of these other things then depend need to be in place for us to have financial stability. And they were absolutely right. Financial stability is at the bottom. You have to have all of those things to get financial stability. And that's certainly what the G20's Financial Stability Board has made clear, is that we need to have stability across all the different capitals, natural capital being the environment, human capital being your internal employees, your workforce, social relational capital being society, human capital, including those across your value chain, use of child labor, etc. Intellectual capital and your investments in intellectual capital. And of course, we need to consider our investments in manufactured intellectual capital and machine learning and artificial intelligence and machine learning. So these are considerations that we need for responsible stewardship. How does an organization demonstrate responsible stewardship? Obviously, it's with good governance, but that all of these multiple capitals, and these are just 6 of them, you can have more, you can have less, are certainly being stewarded responsibly. And that will come out in your organization's reports, for example, an integrated report and your sustainability report. And then finally, in terms of the ISO 37000 certification itself, you can't be certified as an organization on ISO 37000 as an organization. It's not a management system standard and not a certifiable standard. It is a guidance standard. Just like South Africa's King reports, if anyone's used the King reports, you can't be certified on your application of the King reports. You could certainly comply with them. And what that compliance means is that you've complied in the apply and explain regime, which is the same regime that we have in 37,000. What that means in compliance with it means that you've applied the principles and you've explained how you've applied the principles. That's what compliance means. Even so far as in King 4 has recommended practices, those recommended practices are not compliance requirements. They are recommended to be considered when applying the principles, and applying your principles is the compliance requirement. 37,000 has the same thing, key aspects of practice. So there's no compliance requirement in terms of the key aspects of practice. The compliance requirement is in, and if there is one, is in the application of the principles. So like the King reports, application of the principles then explain how you are applying the principles. So that's how the certification around ISO 37000 works. So then how do we go about creating an ISO 37000 certification that's been endorsed by the GGA? We do a certification of understanding. Now, I told you, Mark, that it's not just good enough to recall these acronyms. And certainly you can read the standard and you can regurgitate the standard, but to actually understand the standard, what we've done I've partnered with an organization called the Fluid Rock Governance Group and Candle Governance, and essentially through Candle we have input into this certification program a level of understanding, some content to enable those doing the course to understand ISO 37000. So it's just a different level of learning, a higher level of learning. We partnered with an organization called APMG International, which does international certifications. And the GGA has endorsed this course. Thank you very much, Mark. I am the trainer of this course. It is e-learning. I'm the presenter of videos on the course, so I won't be there personally to train you, but I have captured videos that you can see on the course, and the training organization is Fluid Rock Governance Group. So this is the course, and Mark, really, I just hand over to you in terms of questions on the course or any questions in terms of what I've presented today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carolyn. So yeah, we do have some questions. The first one is from Tabo. Are the UN's SDGs expected to be incorporated into IFRS S1 and S2 standards? And given their novelty, how are emerging markets expected to also adopt or implement those standards?
So the UN SDGs are written for nations. It's the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So your country, the country has adopted the SDGs and has set targets for itself in terms of its achievement of the UN SDGs. It's going to expect, your country is going to expect that you as an organization are contributing to the achievement of those UN SDGs. So your country is going to expect you to be able to demonstrate how you are contributing to the achievement of your country's goals. So it's never expected that the UN SDGs will be reflected in the IFRS standards, because it's a UN coming together on sustainable, global, national, international sustainable development. Your country has goals, and then you as an organization and your country's wanting you to indicate to it what UN SDGs are you impacting negatively and positively. So that's how that works. In terms of developing countries, the ESG, the Good Governance Academy, has established a program called the ESG Exchange. And the ESG Exchange is bringing out guidance, free to access guidance for all sizes and types of organizations on how to implement the various sustainability reporting standards. Now, the developing countries, organizations in developing countries come to me and say, oh, it's unfair to meet these targets and whatever, and how the global south is being required to meet these tremendous targets. The issue is that your country is actually negotiating those targets. And if your country can't demonstrate why it can't achieve those certain targets, then it's for your country to negotiate more effectively against those targets. Now, how can your country negotiate those targets? Well, they need information. And where do they get the information from? It's not just scientific information, because that's based over hundreds and thousands of years. They need corporate information today. So the sooner organizations in a developing country can get that information to their national negotiation teams, the better the national team has to say, we can't, because we are producing countries and we have to emit greenhouse gases to be able to manufacture, to supply to the global north in their consumer-driven economies. So we can't have that discussion until we have that data. So that's really where that comes from.
Great, thank you. Another one from Tavo, who's asking, how do the governance best practices and standards apply to non-profit companies?
It absolutely applies for non-profit companies, the ISO 37000 standard. We made absolutely certain of that. We have had many non-profit organizations, representative bodies in the development of these standards. Non-profit organizations have particular requirements and particular problems when applying the standards that other organizations perhaps don't. So, for example, in very large multinational organizations that have hundreds of thousands of employees, problems going to be communicating the board's intentions to all of those employees, and the board having to consume and reply and oversee the organizations that has so much information. So those are the problems of a very large entity, and so they got committee structures to do that, etc. In a non-profit organization, your biggest problems are going to be things like, especially membership bodies, there's independence of thought and thinking, because your members are representatives on the board. So you've got, actually, it's, the chicken and the turkey voting for Christmas. So you've got the members saying that, no, we don't want our membership fees to go up, but the organization is not going to be financially sustainable if the membership fees don't go up. So that brings a conflict of interest. So you've got different problems, but the principles are still the same. And that's why we need to recognize that those recommended practices or key aspects of practice are not required, cannot be required. They're only guidance in terms of the application of the principles. every organization has to decide in their own way how to apply those principles for their organization.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Karen. A local question here in South Africa. Tabo again, with these principles, how prepared are our legal frameworks and regionally, say that Africa and globally to ensure alignment? The law matters and have an impact on consequences.
So again, I'm going to use my poor kids. Just as an indication of how compliance versus guidance standards, we here, how people are organizations are not going to practice good governance because they're not compliance requirements. We saw what happened with compliance requirements with the Sarbanes-Oxley in the US. Lots and lots of money spent, still no traction, because that it's checking the box. Mm-hmm. So if I say to my kids going to school, you must go to school because the law says you must go to school, and you must pass your exams because that's how you get to progress through the school. But we never do that. We never say you must go to school because the law says you must go to school. When we kiss our kids goodbye, when they go off to school, we say, go and have fun, do your best, maximize your time available, maximize the resources, do sport, do extramural activities, make the most of your time at school. And that's what we want from our organizations. Go and do your best. So what we have, and I'm just saying, just a way to explain it, our legal framework is the must. And we get that out of the GRC acronym, governance, risk, and compliance. Compliance is what you must do. And essentially, it's society's minimum acceptable behavior. But we don't want to do only our must. We don't want our organizations to only just go to school. We want our organizations to do their best. And what does doing your best look like? It looks like your codes and standards and reports. So that's where doing your best lives. So, and we've used in South Africa, you say, Tabo, it's a South African question. In South Africa, the King reports have been used as the basis on which to hold directors accountable on what their duties, their fiduciary duties should look like. And that is what the King reports are enabling in the courts of law. And it's what we will see the world over as well.
Thank you. The last question we have is from Suzanne. How would we integrate the standard against ethical and sustainability, such as WITA and CESA, as they frequently ask about the applicability and integration? I'm not familiar with CESA, S-I-Z-A.
I'm not familiar with it either. Maybe we can Google it quickly. But just in terms of the alignment between the standards, and the ethics. So certainly in the standard itself, 37,000, we've got embedded in the foundational principle, which is purpose. There's two parts to that principle. It's purpose and organizational values. And there the standard speaks about making sure that you do have the organizational values established, which would include a code of ethics and a code of behavior for a code of conduct, for example, which is then a representation or the representation of a behavior in a conduct, what conduct is expected. And that's more, we can have performance management around conduct as opposed to ethics. And then at a more global scale, we have ISBA. So the International Audit and Assurance Standards Board is currently developing a standard, the ISSA, a 5,000 standard, which is an assurance standard for sustainability reporting. And that actually is not only used for accountants, it can be used by any practitioner. But it does state there that to use that assurance standard, it must be governed under an ethics code, some code of ethics. Now, accountants are governed under ISBA's code. So those are ethics standards for accountants. So ISBA has got a code that is established for the ethics of ethical reporting and code of conduct when it comes to financial reporting. But ISBA is developing a code similar to the accounting standards that is applicable for all kinds of practitioners, so that that can be applied. It isn't embedded in these standards, but certainly it's an expectation. It's in the foundational principle of governance that we need ethical behavior established. And it's also called out in the leadership principle. The leadership principle, which is an enabling principle, is ethical and effective leadership, which in South Africa we know is the definition of corporate governance, is ethical and effective leadership, and that's called out in ISO 37,000. So that's how it's embedded in 37,000, and then I just showed you a little bit about how it's expected to be embedded in sustainability reporting.
Perfect.
I hope that answers the question. I'd love to hear more. So connect with me on LinkedIn and ask me further. I'd like to understand those acronyms.
Perfect. Well, I see we're at the top of the hour, so I think we're brought to a close there. So I just want to say thanks so much, Carolyn, for this. And not only was it an excellent insight into the course, it was also wonderful to understand the intention of the ISO standard, especially from the perspective of someone who was so deeply involved in the development of it. Governance is such a critical but often misunderstood concept, and I really believe that the standard in this course will help organizations use it to generate value. To many, governance is a framework of formal policies and procedures and control systems, when in truth it's so much more. So I see governance more of as a philosophy which guides the underlying principles and values of an organization, and principles that include things like transparency, accountability, and fairness, responsibility, as you mentioned earlier, Carolyn. So I think it determines the ethos and mindset that an organization adopts in its approach to fulfilling its purpose, focusing on ethical behavior, long-term sustainability of the organization, and the impact on society. And I think these have always been components of what we call good governance, but sadly very few stakeholders have paid attention, including the investor community that you mentioned earlier. So until they were raised by the ESG brigade. And I've nothing against the ESG or any acronym that includes G. You mentioned GRC earlier, but I think it's just important for us to re-establish governance and show that it's the driver of these behaviours, and the ethics, sustainability, all these other things we've been talking about are the valuable byproducts. So this is exactly what the GGA is trying to achieve, and courses such as this are helping us achieve. So that really excites me. So I'll end here by saying a big thank you again to Carolyn for sharing her insights today. Thank you to Fluid Rock for partnering with the GGA and sharing this course with a global community. And to you, our audience, thanks so much for joining us. If you have any feedback or comments, please feel free to share these with me. We're here to serve you, so please let us know what's important to you. And finally, if you haven't already done so, please join our mailing list, follow us on LinkedIn, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where we post all of these events. We'll soon be sharing shorter bite-sized content as well. So I'll look forward to seeing you all next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.